Picture this. May 19th, 1536. Dawn breaks over the Tower of London. A queen kneels in the straw on a black-draped scaffold, her neck exposed, waiting for a sword she cannot see. In minutes, her head will roll. But what if I told you that everything you think you know about Anne Boleyn's death is a carefully constructed lie? What if the real story, the one they tried to bury, is far more disturbing than history books dare to tell? The executioner wears soft shoes. Did you catch that detail? Soft shoes. Died. Not to show mercy, but to muffle his footsteps so Anne wouldn't hear him coming. So she wouldn't know when the blade would fall. This wasn't an execution. This was theater. And the man who directed every horrifying detail wasn't Thomas Cromwell. It was her husband, the king himself. But here's where it gets darker. Henry VIII didn't just want Anne dead. He wanted her erased, obliterated, as if she had never existed. And for nearly 500 years his cover-up almost worked. Almost. Because hidden in dusty archives, buried in coded letters, and whispered in the terrified testimonies of those who witnessed it, lies the truth about what really happened in those final 17 days. The truth about who betrayed her. Truth about what was done to her. And the truth about why, even today, there are those who don't want this story told. Stay with me. Because what I'm about to reveal will change everything you thought you knew about one of history's most famous executions. And I promise you, by the end of this, you'll understand why this story was never meant to see the light of day. Let's go back to a time when England itself was burning. The year is 1536, and the kingdom stands on the edge of chaos. Henry VIII has torn his realm apart, broken with Rome, declared himself head of the church, all for one woman, Anne Boleyn. For 7 years he pursued her. 7 years of obsession, of waiting, of rewriting the laws of God and man just to make her his queen. He divorced a beloved queen, Catherine of Aragon. He defied the Pope. He risked war with the most powerful empire in Europe, all for Anne. And now, just 3 years after their wedding, he wants her dead. But this isn't a simple story of a king who tired of his wife. This is something far more sinister. Because Anne Boleyn didn't just die. She was systematically destroyed. Her name, her reputation, her very existence. And the men who did it, they left breadcrumbs. Clues scattered across centuries. Documents that were overlooked. Letters that were damaged in fires. Testimonies that were suppressed. And when you piece them together, when you really look at what happened in those final days of April and May 1536, you realize something chilling. This was a conspiracy. A carefully orchestrated plot that reached into the highest levels of power. And at its center stood not just the king's chief minister, Thomas Cromwell, but the king himself. Here's what they don't tell you in school. Anne Boleyn was the first queen of England ever executed. Ever. In 1,000 years of English monarchy, no king had ever dared to kill his own wife. The very idea was unthinkable. Monstrous. And Henry knew this. He knew that executing a crowned and anointed queen would shock the Christian world. It could spark rebellion. It could destroy his legitimacy. So he had to be careful. Methodical. He had to make it look justified. He had to make people believe she deserved it. And that meant fabricating crimes so horrific, so unthinkable, that no one would question her death. But before we get to the execution, before we see that sword swing down, we need to understand what led Anne to that scaffold. Because this story doesn't begin with her death. It begins with a miscarriage, a failed pregnancy, and a sermon that signed her death warrant. January 29th, 1536. The same day Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, the woman Anne replaced, is being buried. Anne suffers a devastating miscarriage. But this isn't just any miscarriage. The timing is catastrophic. And here's the detail that should make your blood run cold. Some sources suggest the fetus was deformed. A shapeless mass of flesh, one later writer claimed. Now, we can't prove that. The evidence is murky. But what matters is what Henry believed. Because in the superstitious mind of a 16th century king, a deformed child meant only one thing: witchcraft. God's judgment. A sign that the marriage itself was cursed. Henry had already been eyeing Jane Seymour, one of Anne's own ladies-in-waiting. Pale, demure, obedient, everything Anne was not. And now, with Anne's failure to produce a male heir becoming undeniable, Henry's attention shifts completely. But he can't just divorce Anne like he did Catherine. He's already broken with Rome to marry her. Another divorce would make him look weak, indecisive, ridiculous. So divorce isn't an option. There's only one other way out. Easter, 1536. Anne's almoner, her chaplain John Skipp, delivers a sermon in front of the entire court. The king is there. Cromwell is there. And everyone listens as Skipp tells the biblical story of Queen Esther, a righteous queen who saved her people from an evil counselor, who plotted against them. The evil counselor's name? Haman. And in the story, Haman ends up executed on the very gallows he built for others. The message is unmistakable. Anne is Esther. Cromwell is Haman. And Anne has just publicly declared war on the most powerful man in England after the king himself. Cromwell reportedly falls ill for a week after this sermon. But here's what you need to understand. Cromwell isn't sick. He's strategizing. He's plotting. Because Anne Boleyn has just made a fatal mistake. She's given him the motivation he needs. And Thomas Cromwell is a man who doesn't lose. Within 3 weeks, Anne Boleyn will be arrested. But how do you arrest a queen? What crime could possibly justify it? Remember, consensual adultery wasn't even treason under English law in 1536. The treason law of 1352 said nothing about a queen's infidelity. So Cromwell needs something bigger, something darker. And he finds it in the words of a frightened court musician named Mark Smeaton. April 30th, 1536. Mark Smeaton is summoned to Cromwell's house in Stepney. He is a nobody, a musician, a servant, insignificant compared to the great lords of the court. But Anne had spoken to him recently. A brief exchange, witnessed by others. She'd asked him why he looked so sad. He brushed her off, said it was nothing. An innocent moment. But in Cromwell's hands, innocent moments become weapons. What happens in Cromwell's house that night remains one of the darkest mysteries of Tudor history. Some sources say Smeaton was tortured with a knotted rope twisted around his head and eyes. Others claim he was threatened, manipulated, broken down psychologically over 20 brutal hours of interrogation. One letter, in Cromwell's collection, states he was grievously racked. But this might be false, because Smeaton walked to his execution, something a racked man couldn't do. But here's what we know for certain. After 20 hours in Cromwell's custody, Mark Smeaton confesses. He admits to having sexual intercourse with Queen Anne Boleyn on 3 separate occasions. He names dates. He names places. And, crucially, he names other men, courtiers, nobles, men close to the king. That confession changes everything. Because now, Cromwell has the opening he needs. Now he can claim the queen isn't just unfaithful. She's conspiring. She's plotting. She's surrounding herself with lovers who could be accessories to treason. The net closes fast. May 1st. King Henry VIII attends the May Day jousts at Greenwich with Anne at his side. Everything seems normal. But then, suddenly, Henry stands up and leaves. Abruptly. Without explanation. He rides away with a small group of intimates, and during that ride, he interrogates his close friend Sir Henry Norris, groom of the stool, one of his most trusted servants. Henry questions him, pressures him, promises him pardon if he'll just utter the truth. But Norris maintains his innocence. He refuses to confess. And by dawn the next day, he's in the Tower of London. May 2nd, I. Anne Boleyn is arrested at Greenwich. She's taken by barge down the Thames to the Tower, entering through the private water gate, the same gate she passed through just 3 years earlier when she came here, in triumph for her coronation. The same royal apartments that prepared for her queenship now become her prison, and she has no idea why. According to William Kingston, the constable of the Tower who guards her, Anne is bewildered, terrified. She swears her innocence. She says she's as clear from the company of man as for sin. But Kingston is reporting everything she says back to Cromwell. Every word, every gesture. Because Anne doesn't realize the trap that's been set. She keeps talking, trying to defend herself, and in her panic, she makes a fatal error. She recalls a conversation with Henry Norris. A bit of courtly flirtation. She joked that if the king died, Norris would be looking to step into his shoes as her husband. It was meant as teasing, as the kind of elaborate, courtly love banter that was common in Tudor court culture. But when Kingston reports this to Cromwell, it becomes evidence of something far more sinister. Conspiracy to murder the king. Because the Treasons Act of 1534 makes it clear, even imagining the death of the king is high treason. And Anne has just admitted, in her own words, to imagining what would happen after Henry died. With Smeaton's confession of adultery already secured, and Anne's own careless words recorded, Cromwell now has everything he needs. The charges are drawn up. Adultery with multiple men, incest with her own brother George Boleyn, and conspiracy to murder the king. Each charge more horrific than the last. Each designed to make her death not just acceptable, but necessary. May 12th. 4 men, Smeaton, Norris, Weston, and Brereton, are tried at Westminster Hall. All are found guilty. Only Smeaton pleads guilty. The others maintain their innocence to the end. But it doesn't matter. The verdict is predetermined. May 15th, that Anne and her brother George are tried within the Tower itself by a court of 26 peers. Their uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, presides. Anne's own father, Thomas Boleyn, sits on the jury that will condemn his daughter and son to death. Think about that. A father watching his children tried for their lives, knowing he must vote for their execution or risk his own destruction. Both are found guilty. The sentence is read aloud. Anne is to be burned here within the Tower of London on the Green, or else to have thy head smitten off, per the king's pleasure. Burning at the stake or beheading, the choice is Henry's. And this is where the story takes its darkest turn, because a document, discovered in the National Archives, a warrant book from 1536, reveals something historians have long suspected but couldn't prove. Henry VIII personally orchestrated every single detail of Anne Boleyn's execution. Every single detail. He chooses beheading over burning, claiming he's moved by pity. But the document shows him mapping out the logistics with chilling precision. He orders Sir William Kingston to omit nothing from his instructions. He decides the method, a sword, not an axe. He arranges for a French executioner, an expert swordsman from Calais, to be brought over specifically for this task. He even chooses the location, Tower Green, private, contained where only select witnesses would see. One historian who studied the document said he knows exactly how and where he wants it to happen. Why a sword? The official story is that Henry wanted to grant Anne a more dignified end, that a sword would be quicker and cleaner than an axe, which, as history shows, could take multiple brutal blows. But there's another theory, darker and more probable. Henry is thinking about his reputation. He's executing his wife, his queen, the mother of his daughter, and he knows how this looks. He needs it to appear merciful, controlled, civilized. So he imports an executioner from France d'Artois. He has the scaffold draped in black cloth. He limits the witnesses. He stages every element to look like justice rather than murder. But here's the detail that reveals his true nature. The execution is scheduled, then delayed. The French swordsman doesn't arrive on time. So Anne, who has prepared herself to die, who has said her prayers and made her peace, has to wait another day, another night in the tower, knowing that dawn will bring her death. The psychological torture of that extra day is unimaginable. And where is Henry during this time? He's at Hampton Court with Jane Seymour, planning their wedding. May 17th at Kewum. Anne's brother George and the 4 accused men are taken to Tower Hill and beheaded. George goes first, spared the horror of watching his friends die. Mark Smeaton goes last, kneeling at a block already soaked with blood. Even on the scaffold, Smeaton doesn't recant his confession, which infuriates Anne. She can't understand why he would lie, why he would do this to her. Unless he didn't lie, unless he was promised mercy, unless he genuinely believed after 20 hours in Cromwell's custody that Anne had somehow encouraged his attention. We'll never know. But his confession, true or false, sealed not just his fate, but hers. May 18th, Anne's marriage to Henry is annulled, declared null and void. This is crucial, because it means their daughter Elizabeth is now officially a bastard, removed from the line of succession. It also means that technically, Anne was never really queen at all. And if she was never queen, then Henry isn't executing his wife. He's executing a traitor who pretended to be queen. The psychological manipulation is breathtaking. May 19th, 1536. Shortly after 8 in the morning, the constable of the Tower informs Anne that the time has come. And according to Kingston's own report, Anne's response is shocking. She jokes about it. I heard say the executioner was very good, she says, and I have a little neck, and then she puts her hands around her throat and laughs. Laughs. Contemporary witnesses describe her as calm, composed, unnaturally serene. One Portuguese observer writes that never had the Queen looked so beautiful. Another account says she went to her execution with an untroubled countenance. How is this possible? How does a woman facing such horror appear not just brave, but almost radiant? Some historians believe Anne experienced a kind of religious transcendence in those final days, that she realized death was her only escape, and that dying innocent would prove Henry's guilt before God. Others suggest shock, dissociation, a psychological break from reality. But whatever the truth, the woman who climbs those scaffold steps is not broken. She is transformed. She wears a gown of black damask with a cape trimmed in ermine, emphasizing even now that she is queen. Under the black gown, some accounts say she wears a red kirtle, red being the color of Catholic martyrdom. Every detail of her appearance is a statement. I am innocent. I am queen. I am martyr. Approximately 20 people witness the execution. It's deliberately kept small, private, controlled. Anne delivers a brief speech, conventional in its wording. Good Christian people, I am come hither to die. For according to the law, and by the law, I am judged to die, and therefore I will speak nothing against it. I pray God save the king and send him long to reign over you, for a gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never. Some historians believe these words are laced with bitter irony. Others think Anne is protecting Elizabeth, knowing that any criticism of Henry would put her daughter in danger. But listen to those words again. A gentler nor a more merciful prince was there never. She doesn't say my husband. She doesn't say the man I love. She calls him gentle and merciful while he's executing her for crimes everyone knows she didn't commit. The subtext is deafening. Her ladies remove her cape and gown. They bind her hair under a linen cap. They tie a blindfold over her eyes. This detail is confirmed by multiple sources, though some accounts differ. Anne kneels, upright in the straw. What? There's no block because the sword requires her to be in this position. And then comes the moment that makes this execution truly horrifying. The French executioner, who has been standing behind a pile of straw to conceal his sword, calls out to someone on the other side of the scaffold. "Bring me the sword." It's a trick. Anne turns her head toward the voice, distracted, her neck exposed. And in that instant, while she's looking the wrong way, the executioner draws his blade from the straw and swings. A single stroke. Her head is severed completely. The cannons along the tower wall fire immediately, signaling her death. And at that exact moment, several miles away at Hampton Court, Henry VIII hears the boom. He's been waiting, watching, and the moment he knows she's dead, he rides to Jane Seymour's chambers. Within hours, he's formally betrothed to her. 11 days later, they're married. But let's return to the tower, to that scaffold, to Anne's body lying in the straw avenue. Because here's what they really tried to hide. No preparations were made for her burial. None. No coffin. No grave. No ceremony. Her body lies on the scaffold for hours while her traumatized ladies try to figure out what to do. Finally, they find an old arrow chest, a wooden box used to store arrows, and they put her body in it. Her head. Her torso. Crammed into a chest meant for weapons. She's carried to the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the tower and buried in an unmarked grave near where her brother was placed 2 days earlier. No funeral. No prayers. No acknowledgement that the woman being buried was, until this morning, the Queen of England. And then the erasure begins. Henry orders every painting of Anne destroyed. Every portrait. Every image. Her heraldic badges are literally chiseled out of the stonework at Hampton Court and replaced with Jane Seymour's. Her name is removed from documents. Her daughter Elizabeth, just 2 years old, is declared a bastard and stripped of her title. For the rest of Henry VIII's reign, 10 more years, Anne Boleyn ceases to exist in official records. It's as if she was never born. But here's what Henry couldn't erase: the witnesses, the people who were there, the letters they wrote, the accounts they recorded. And in these fragments, these scattered pieces of testimony, we find the truth they tried to bury. Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador and Anne's enemy, admits in his letters that only Smeaton's confession held any weight. Everyone else was condemned upon presumption and certain indications without valid proof or confession. Even Anne's enemy acknowledges the evidence was fabricated. The specific dates and locations in the indictment, 3/4 of them can be proven false. Anne wasn't where they claimed she was. The encounters couldn't have happened. The entire case is built on impossibilities. And the most damning piece of evidence against the conspiracy, it comes from Cromwell himself. After Anne's death, Cromwell tells Chapuis that he set himself to devise and conspire the said affair. His own words. He admits to plotting against her. But, and this is crucial, he says he was authorized and commissioned by the king to do it. Not acting alone. Following orders. The king's orders. This wasn't Cromwell's conspiracy. It was Henry's. Cromwell was the instrument, but Henry was the architect. And the motive? It's simpler and more chilling than any elaborate theory. Henry wanted a son. Anne couldn't give him one. He wanted Jane Seymour. Anne was in the way. And rather than face the humiliation of another divorce, rather than admit his mistake in breaking with Rome for a woman who failed him, Henry chose murder. Legal, sanctioned, carefully staged murder, but dressed up as justice. The aftermath ripples through history in ways that still matter today. Because Elizabeth, Anne's daughter, grows up knowing her mother was executed as a traitor and adulteress. She grows up with no memory of Anne, no portraits, no acknowledgement. And yet, when Elizabeth becomes queen in 1558, one of England's greatest monarchs, she quietly begins to rehabilitate her mother's reputation. Anne's prayer book, the one she supposedly carried to her execution, is passed down through a secret network of women. Hidden messages in the book reveal how these women risked their lives to preserve something touched by Anne, because possessing anything associated with her could be seen as treason. But they kept it anyway, passed it from mother to daughter, aunt to niece. And when Elizabeth becomes queen, that book, with Anne's handwritten inscription, "Remember me when you do pray," that hope doth lead from day to day, becomes not evidence of treason, but proof that Anne was innocent all along. Thomas Cromwell. He engineers Anne's destruction so efficiently that Henry rewards him with greater power than ever. But Cromwell makes one fatal mistake. He arranges Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves, a German princess whose portrait Henry liked but whose actual appearance disappointed him. The marriage is a disaster, and Henry, furious at being deceived, turns on Cromwell with the same sudden brutality he showed Anne. In 1540, just 4 years after Anne's execution, Cromwell is arrested on charges of treason and heresy. The same playbook. The same swift, merciless process. And on July 28, 1540, Thomas Cromwell is beheaded on Tower Hill. The man who perfected the art of judicial murder becomes its victim. Henry VIII himself? He marries Jane Seymour and finally gets his son, Edward, who will die at 15. He'll marry 3 more times. He'll execute another wife, Catherine Howard, in 1542 for adultery, though this time he uses an axe, not a sword. No special mercy for her. By the time Henry dies in 1547, he's a bloated, paranoid tyrant, his leg rotting with ulcers, his court terrified, his kingdom exhausted. But Anne Boleyn's legacy, it survives him, because Elizabeth I reigns for 45 years, defeats the Spanish Armada, presides over a golden age of English culture, and never marries. She's called the Virgin Queen, but maybe she's more than that. Maybe she's the daughter who avenged her mother by proving that a woman, Anne's daughter, could be the greatest monarch England ever had. Still, questions remain. Questions that even now, nearly 500 years later, we cannot fully answer. Did Anne actually have an affair with anyone? Almost certainly. The evidence is too contrived, too convenient, too obviously fabricated. But did she act with the political savvy necessary to survive Henry's court? No, too well. She antagonized the wrong people. She made enemies. She underestimated how quickly fortune could turn. Was she guilty of anything? Of failing to produce a son. Of being too outspoken. Of not being demure enough, submissive enough, quiet enough for a king who wanted a wife, not a partner. Those were her only crimes. And for those she paid with her life. But here's the final secret. The one that disturbs me most. Henry knew she was innocent. He knew. The fabricated evidence, the tortured confession, the rushed trial, the immediate betrothal to Jane Seymour, it all proves he knew. This wasn't a king deceived by a wicked queen. This was a king who deliberately murdered his wife because she failed to serve his purposes. And he got away with it. For centuries, history remembered Anne Boleyn as the seductress who destroyed a marriage, the adulteress who got what she deserved, the witch who cursed her own children. Even now, she's often depicted as scheming, manipulative, ambitious to the point of destruction. But when you actually examine the evidence, when you read the documents, when you see how carefully this conspiracy was constructed, you realize Anne Boleyn was the victim of the most powerful man in England, and he spent the rest of his life making sure no one would know the truth. That night, after the cannons fired, after Anne's head was wrapped in cloth and her body stuffed in an arrow chest, Henry VIII sat down to dinner and played tennis. Witnesses recorded his cheerful mood. He was, they said, remarkably happy. A queen was dead. His wife, the mother of his child, Dotto, the woman he'd moved heaven and earth to marry. And he was happy. That's the truth they tried to hide. Not just that Anne was innocent, but that Henry was a monster, a murderer, a man who could order his wife's execution, orchestrate every detail, and then celebrate with a game of tennis and a new betrothal. The sword that killed Anne Boleyn disappeared from history. No one knows what happened to it. The French executioner returned to Calais and vanished from records. The witnesses, went silent. Kingston, who guarded Anne in her final days, never spoke of it publicly again. The conspiracy of silence worked, for a while. But the truth has a way of surviving. In documents tucked away in archives. In letters damaged by fire but not destroyed. In the words of a prayer book passed between frightened women. In the reign of a daughter who became everything her father wanted in a son. Anne Boleyn's execution wasn't just a historical event. It was a warning. A demonstration of absolute power. Henry was showing his court, his kingdom, his world. This is what happens when you disappoint me. Even if you're queen. Even if you're innocent. Even if you've done everything I asked. It can all end with a sword. If you've made it this far, you now know something that took historians centuries to piece together. You know the truth about Anne Boleyn's death. Not the sanitized version. Not the romantic tragedy. But the cold, calculated murder it really was. Subscribe if you want. More hidden histories, more forgotten truths, more stories they don't want you to know. Leave a comment telling me what shocked you most about this story. And remember, history isn't written by the victors. It's written by the survivors. And sometimes, if we look closely enough, we can hear the voices of those who didn't survive, telling us what really happened, begging us to remember. Anne Boleyn whispered her truth in the moments before her death, and 500 years later, we're finally listening. The sword fell. But the story didn't end. It never does.